Good morning. This is Nancy Schaff. Can everybody hear me? I hope. When I just got back from Nicaragua last night, so I'm sort of wide awake, ready to go. So I have here with me at Cornell Susan Hopkins, our STEM PWT co-chair, and Nigel Gannon, our evaluator for the Academy. And Susan is going to do a bit of a welcoming introduction to kick us off this morning.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the New York State 4-H STEM Academy. It is wonderful that we've got 8 sites from around the state. And what I'd like to do, Nancy's introduce those of us who are here on campus, but I'd like to give a shout out to each one of the regions, and I'd like, when I call your region, if you'd like make big waves so that we can all see who's here. I'd like to welcome Capital. We're unmuted. Or is that muted?
That's mute.
It's from the Capital. Oh, hey, there you are waving. Thank you. How about Finger Lakes? There's a wave. Hi. North Central. Have anyone representing North Central? There we are. Yep. North Country. Anybody?
We just went away.
Okay, there. Southeast. We should have 2 sites for Southeast. Yeah, jumping up and down. That's what we like. South Central. Welcome aboard. Yay. Any Western? Okay. Well, there they are. Great. So even though we all look kind of minuscule, everybody is really important to this presentation. And this academy has a history of a couple of years. We started, National 4-H is supporting the mission way by providing professional development. And the first meeting was in Washington, and representatives from every state attended to encourage professional development in STEM areas. The initiative evolved to providing support to regions to do more localized programming, and that's when a group of you went to Pennsylvania for the Northeast Regional STEM Academy. The outcome from that is that we're now sharing the wonderful resources and information from that academy with all of you statewide. And modeling the inquiry system and interpretation so that we'll be sharing resources, giving chance to self discuss the resources to explore all documents as well as methodology that's now available to us online.
This is Nancy again. I'd like to ask that if every site could please keep your microphone muted, unless for some reason you're speaking, it will really help to have all those mics muted.
I would also add, we are recording this entire Polycom. There were several requests for people who were unable to attend live, and we want to be able to share that with them too.
Okay. I just want to acknowledge the people that attended the Pennsylvania Academy last January. We had Linda Broche, John Bow, Margot Bowerman, Lynette Kay, Becky Ireland Perry, Roger Ort, Eileen McGuire, Nancy Schaff, and Holly Worth. And Holly has since then, unfortunately, left our system. But that's the group that, and Susan was a huge help, and I have to thank her too, even though she wasn't able to go with us. That's the group that has been organizing this experience for all of you. And we were provided a little bit of money to do this from the National 4-H Council, and we're happy to be finally able to follow up from that January Academy. It's hard to believe it's been that long since we did that. Okay, so we have a few goals today listed here on the slide. Hopefully everybody's seeing my desktop. If you're not, let us know. And
we're just seeing a black screen. Is anybody else? Yeah, we've got a black screen up here too.
Oh, what's his name?
Alex.
Alex. Can Alex hear us? Okay, you're supposed to be seeing my computer because that's what we're seeing on this end. Is anybody seeing the computer screen? It's a PowerPoint slide.
We see the screen, it's just really small and unreadable.
We can see it, Suffolk.
You can see it big?
We can see a quarter of the screen. It's
A quarter
the
of the
slide.
screen. Okay.
Um,
All right. This whole thing is an adventure and an experiment, as Susan said, kind of an inquiry-based thing. We're all trying this out.
That right now.
Okay.
It's being recorded, it is being transmitted. We gotta find out what.
Okay, so Al's working on it. We'll just keep talking, and I can read to you what the goals say if you can't see my PowerPoint slide. It says, become more familiar with the 4-H science checklist criteria and how they can guide high-quality 4-H STEM projects. Learn about 4-H STEM terminology and resources. Do a shifted inquiry activity with your colleagues, how we can adapt activities and projects, and learn with and from your colleagues and continue the conversation. The purpose of this activity, this event today, is to just begin a conversation about 4-H STEM programming. We're going to be reintroducing the framework provided by the STEM checklist, which I think most of you have some familiarity with. And this is going to provide an opportunity for you to talk among yourselves and identify strengths, challenges, and needs. And so we really emphasize this is just the beginning, and that we want to hear from you, we want to follow up, we want to go more into depth on the topics we will just touch on today as we go forward in the next couple of years. So we'll be following up with more additional professional volunteer development as you identify what is needed. So we are hoping that you're taking good notes in each of your sites and that you're going to send those notes along to us so that we can all learn from each other. I wish I could be at every one of these sites, but I can't be. We did provide a note-taking sheet on the website. You can use that or some other method, whatever works for you, but we would really like to get notes back from you. So that was the first slide, was the goals. The next slide is the agenda, and many of you may have done an agenda there at your site, where basically the agenda is the introduction to science readiness and the STEM checklist, and then we're going to go through each of the criteria that make up the checklist. Essential elements, adult roles, experiential and inquiry-based learning, outcomes, science abilities, science standards, and then we're going to wrap up with just talking a little bit about assessing science readiness. So we're going to try to stick to the time framework we've set aside to the extent possible. Susan will be telling you more in the next slide about how we're going to handle questions and so forth. We will try to handle as many questions during the 2-hour Polycom as we can. We may not be able to get to all questions. We will track every question that comes in, and we will find some way to continue answering, discussing, whatever it takes to deal with all the questions that come in. But we are limiting ourselves to these 2 hours of Polycom. We're hoping that you're going to extend that at your own sites to extend the discussions, and that it will extend far beyond today.
The primary presentation mode is the Polycom, and I hope that everyone will shortly be able to at least see the slides. In the meantime, in addition to that, in order to provide some live chat opportunity for immediate questions that come up, we've activated a WebEx session, and you can log on to that by going to the website Cornell University, that's one word, .webex, WEBEX.com, and look for our meeting, the New York State 4-H STEM Academy, and if you need a password, it's science. But I thought I had made it an open session so that you should be able to just enter it. I am also attempting to share my screen, and I will have the slides following along with Nancy's, and that might be an alternative to viewing the slides. Right now we've got the ACRA site up, and Roger Ort as well. So I'll look forward to having as many of you are able to, from a computer, join the WebEx meeting.
So if you're not able to join the
And
WebEx meeting, then you'll need to speak up over the Polycom and let us know if you're having a problem. Otherwise, you can use the chat once you get in there.
any questions?
Does anybody have any questions? We're going to put our mute on for a minute to see if anybody has any questions. Okay, we're not hearing from anybody, so hopefully that's working for you. So the next slide is just sort of that engagement kind of questions to get you thinking. How much do you know, it says, is the title. Are you familiar with the 4-H Science Checklist? Is it useful? Can you explain what 4-H Science Ready means? And those are just sort of thought questions for you. And in the spirit of thinking about engaging prior knowledge, and engaging prior knowledge is a really key part of learning, according to research. So that's kind of what this slide is all about. So that's what we're going to be exploring, is the science checklist and what does it mean and how can it be useful to us. So the next slide says definition, 4-H science. And 4-H science is what it is called, what we do is called at the national level. In New York, we're calling it 4-H STEM. I'm going to go into that a little bit more in a minute. But 4-H science is the combination of the context of youth development and the content and processes of science. So we're combining both those things, youth development and science. And that's what it means to have a 4-H Science Ready programs. That we're paying attention to the content process of science, and we're paying attention to the context of youth development. So when we're doing 4-H Science Ready programs, that's what we mean. And what came up for us, those of us that went to Pennsylvania, is we kept saying that it's important for us to all sort of be on the same page, to be speaking a common language when we're talking about these things, to have sort of a basic set of concepts that we all understand that underlie the 4-H STEM programming we do, so that we can all be consistent when we're making funding requests, when we're working with our partners in the community, when we're writing reports, when we're doing evaluations, and all those other things, that we can be consistent across the state when we're talking about 4-H STEM. So the next slide says, setting the stage, talking about informal, non-formal, and formal STEM education. So 4-H, in most cases, we do non-formal education. And in different places, different groups, you'll see these words used differently. If you are applying for a federal grant from, say, the National Science Foundation or NASA or something like that, there's just formal and there's informal. So if you're writing a grant to them, we would fall under informal science education. But we make that further distinction of separating informal and non-formal. And there is a pretty important distinction between those two. If you can see the slide, there is a model here that shows informal on the left, formal on the right, and in the middle is non-formal. And so you have individual project work, which is member-directed, coming from the informal side, and you have leader-directed group project work coming from the right side, and meeting in the middle with non-formal. So the informal is learning on your own. The formal is learning that is controlled by a teacher or somebody else. And the non-formal is learning that is facilitated. So that's the kind of learning we do. Informal, we would think of as going to a museum, learning at home on your own, going to the library, all those kinds of informal things that are not really facilitated. It's learning that your family or an individual pretty much does on their own. Where in the middle we have facilitated learning, which is what we do in 4-H. We generally have a leader who's facilitating the learning. There's some kind of a structure, and generally ongoing. It's not just a one visit to the museum. And those are actually fairly significant distinctions. Okay, so then we get into the idea of STEM. We all know that at one time at the national level we called it SET, Science, Engineering, Technology, and then the national went to 4-H Science, And then in New York, we switched over to using STEM. And so what does the STEM represent? So scientists explore the natural world. Engineers create the design world. Technologists use knowledge to adapt the natural and design world. And math is the language of science, engineering, and technology. So we're generally talking about applied math, which we use math in many, many science projects, sewing, cooking, gardening, hard to do without math. So that kind of just forms the basis of what do we mean by STEM. And one of the handouts we suggested you might want to have today is the handout from Tools of the Trade that's called Explore It, Design It, Use It. And that kind of covers the idea of these different areas and how they overlap somewhere in the middle to create STEM programming. And we played around with this a little bit at State Fair. We had little signs that said, got STEM, my project does. And we tried to think about, well, is there science in this project? Is there engineering? Is there technology? Is there math? And in many cases, the more you think about it, the more you realize either all of them or some of them are there. And we're using STEM in New York because it's what everybody else uses. And so we want to be perceived as being at the table for STEM education. People are hearing about this from many different fronts, from the government, from the president, from all over the place, that STEM education is important. So we want people to recognize that this is what we do in 4-H, that we're part of that community, because in funding community, the education community, the policy community, research, education, all those communities use the word STEM. So it's important for 4-H to be at that table and be using that same language so people perceive that that's what we're doing. So this is, the next slide is, I don't know how many of you are seeing the slides, how many aren't, so I'm going to keep trying to describe what's on the slides in case you're not. So we have 4-H STEM, and then so this is just sort of to outline some of the really common vocabulary that we are using. So 4-H National is what they use at the national level. When I asked Jim Kaler, who's the NEFA science, this guy, why they went from SET to science, he said, well, there's all this controversy about STET versus STEM, and they didn't want to choose, so they went with 4-H science. So I don't know if that was the best reason, but that's what they did. And, some people, they say, well, the problem is then you're saying science, and, do people perceive that you're leaving out engineering and technology and the other things? And then a lot of states are still using SET, science, engineering, technology. And I think I did see recently one other state that's gone to STEM. So maybe we're just leading the charge, and everybody will follow us. So inquiry is one of the things that is really, really key and might seem a little new to a lot of us, to a lot of volunteers. And it doesn't necessarily mean we're not doing it. We may have been doing it, but we want to be very intentional about doing inquiry. And that's one of the things we're going to focus on today, because inquiry is how science is done. And the best way to learn science is to do science. So that's why inquiry is so important. And maybe one of the things that we need to be most intentional about being sure is included in our STEM programming. And then the other one is the STEM abilities. And again, 4-H has chosen to use different vocabulary. In most of the world, we would refer to these as science process skills. And we need those process skills to be able to do inquiry. So when learners do inquiry, they develop abilities to do science and think critically, really important, not just for science, but just for living in a democratic society. They use those abilities to learn by connecting previous knowledge with current experience. So there's also that experiential component to that. And they identify and investigate novel experiences to build new ideas. So that's really important things about having those abilities to do inquiry. But I think the most valuable thing about the way we're doing this today is that you are all together in your districts, however many of you are together, but that it gives you a chance to talk to each other and discuss rather than just sitting at your desk doing a webinar. So hopefully that's valuable for you. And for those of us who were not able to join us today, they'll be able to watch the recording. Okay, so the framework for this whole meeting today that I used was what we are calling the 4-H STEM checklist. You'll see it called the 4-H Science Checklist at the national level. It's all the same thing. It doesn't matter what we call it. We're talking about the same thing. And it will guide us in doing STEM programming. There seemed to be a lot of confusion when this whole SET STEM initiative came out and people were saying, what are we talking about? What does this mean? What does it look like? And the STEM checklist is the answer to that. I think of it as sort of the Rosetta Stone for 4-H STEM programming. If you just keep referring back to this checklist, it'll answer most of those questions that I've heard from people. So it's a really important framework. We're just reintroducing it today just to get a feel for what are the criteria that are included. And then hopefully we'll hear from you where there's need and interest in learning more. So if there's interest in learning more about inquiry, then we can go back and do a whole session just on inquiry or just on adult roles. But today we're just going to touch on each of these criteria, spend a little bit more time on inquiry, and so you'll have a feeling for the foundation for all of our STEM programming. So the STEM checklist, if you're not seeing this slide, it says guides efforts in developing high-quality science programs. I did create a New York State 4-H STEM checklist. I adapted it from the national. It really doesn't matter. Don't get worried. Am I using New York State? Am I using the national? They're interchangeable. It doesn't matter. I just thought it'd be nice for us to have one that says STEM, and I did reorder the criteria a little bit, and I combined two of them. But it answers the questions, how do I know what counts as a science-ready 4-H STEM project, which you have been asked to do in Access. It answers the question, what does a 4-H STEM project look like? I seemed to sense some confusion earlier that, does it have to be something new? Does it have to be GPS, or does it have to be robotics? No, if it can meet the criteria on the STEM checklist, it can be any kind of 4-H project. What elements should be included when planning a 4-H STEM project? So these are all the questions that are answered by using this checklist, and that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time going through. So I took these slides, by permission, were adapted from a national webinar, very heavily adapted, revised, and I sort of took some cues from them, and then I even did some more changing. So we have what I did, and they suggested in that webinar about are you science ready, was I tried to divide the criteria in between youth development youth development context, and then science content and process. So I reordered these to some extent to try to do that. It doesn't matter, like I say, if you use the national one, it's fine, it's all the same. So I put as the number one criteria that it integrates the essential elements of positive youth development. I mean, that is the absolute core criteria for anything we do in 4-H, so I thought that should really be number one. And that the projects are led by trained staff and volunteers, and really, really key is that youth are partners and resources in that process. So those are really important youth development context criteria. Then I had two that I thought kind of overlap between the context content areas, that we are engaging youth in experiential and inquiry-based learning. I combined those two. In the national model, those are two separate criteria, but I don't think they really can be separated. You don't do inquiry by itself. The inquiry needs to be embedded into the experiential model, which is what we always have used in 4-H. So it's just embedding this inquiry into the experiential that we already do. And then number 4 is that we're targeting 4-H science logic model outcomes. And we posted the national logic model that you probably have with you there, and the New York State logic model, which is still a draft. I drafted a logic model. We haven't really had much discussion on it, so I am still very open to people's input about that draft state logic model. But the point is that we are always mindful of what our desired outcomes are, and that we are planning programming around those outcomes. And then the duration and frequency of the program or project is appropriate to reach the outcomes. So whatever outcomes you said you wanted to reach, you need to be sure that you meet often enough and over enough time to actually reach those outcomes. And that's where our rule of thumb 6 hours come in. But obviously it depends what your outcome is, how many hours or days or weeks or months or years it's going to take to reach it. So that's completely dependent on what outcome you're trying to reach. And then the last, the number 5 and number 6 are more just based on that science content and process that target the development of STEM abilities. Because just 4-H is always about skill building. We're building life skill, building science skills, so all these different things. We're going to be building STEM abilities, STEM process skills, and that our projects are based on science standards. And I think this one maybe is the one that's probably the most, to me, it's sort of the most confusing and difficult, especially for volunteers. And I don't think we want to emphasize this with volunteers, but for us, that we are trying to be sure we're doing research-based programs, I think for the educators it's important to just keep that in mind, and I've got some other slides about that. If there's anybody out there who would like to present any of these different criteria, you're going to get really tired of listening to me. So I would welcome anyone that wants to jump in. Let us know if you want to talk about one of these areas. Eileen and Roger both volunteered to do the inquiry section. So if there's anybody else that would like to jump in when you get tired of listening to me and Susan, please feel free to do so if you feel like you'd really like to talk to one of these, because otherwise you're just going to keep hearing me. We are going to stop and let you talk amongst yourself, though, so we're almost done with the just straight talking. So we're now on the first. We're going to go into a little more detail. Like I say, it's still just an introduction. We're not going to go in depth, but we're introducing the first of the New York STEM checklist criteria, which is the integration of essential elements of positive youth development. So the easiest way to remember that, and all of us that are around, were around when Kath Ann Kress were here, I always think of Kath Ann, the belonging, independence, generosity, and mastery. I think Kath Ann brought that to New York, and then I think she brought it to the nation when she went to Washington to be the national 4-H leader. So I always think of Kath Ann when I think of those. But that's the easiest way to think about the essential elements are those 4 main: belonging, independence, generosity, and mastery. You also have there was a handout recommended, the essential elements fact sheet, which you might have in front of you. That gives you more detail about the essential elements beyond just those 4 overriding. There really are 8. And I think it's more meaningful if you look at the 8 elements and that those 4 overriding concepts work into those 8 elements. So I've got a couple of questions on the slide if you still aren't able to see it. How do high-quality 4-H STEM programs and projects contribute to positive youth development? So we always need to be thinking, that's always the bottom line in 4-H, is that we are developing young people as whole people. And so we always want to be mindful of how do our STEM programs contribute to positive youth development. And then you want to ask yourself, does the programming intentionally provide youth opportunities, belonging, independence, generosity, and mastery? So we want to really build in that intentionality, that we are really thinking about these things, that they aren't just, well, we hope they happen, but we haven't really built them in. So it's really important to keep thinking about the intentionality. So we're going to have you stop for a minute so that you can have a chance to talk to each other. And what I want you to think about is take your essential elements fact sheet and anything else you want to look at. Also in the supplemental resources, there is an essential elements curriculum. So if you feel that your volunteers have a need to learn more about essential elements, there is a curriculum available on the national level that you could do with volunteers. So I have one suggestion. If you want to talk about something else at your site, you're more than welcome to do that. But my suggestion was to stop and think about what ways can STEM programming promote each of those 4 elements: belonging, independence, generosity, and mastery. Are there any of those that we could not promote using STEM? So we're going to put our mic on mute, and we'll give you 3 minutes to just talk about that amongst yourself.
Well, welcome back. I hope that had a chance to, I know it's not much time, but you've had a chance to at least begin the conversation. At this point, we'd invite any one of the groups to share at least one topic that they addressed in your site conversation.
Can you hear me, Nancy and Susan?
Yes, we can.
Okay, this is Roger here in Schuyler. We brought up the little topic about robotics and the little bit about belonging, that some of the kids really are not that outgoing in school and they feel a little bit alienated because of they're very hands-on and something like that. But through the group, they get the confidence to do a public presentation and think outside the box a little bit. Also with the generosity of teaching another teammate who may not be good at programming or building, but working with them because they feel that group is real comfortable and can work together.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great because you can easily see how robotics could hit all four of those. Is there anybody else that wanted to share?
Microphone. Oh, remember to unmute your microphone if you'd like to share.
Can you hear Oneida County?
Yes, we can.
We felt that putting the belonging, independence, generosity, and mastery was really not that difficult for us to do. Not that we're great, perfect at it, but our problem seems to be getting leaders to trainings. Anybody have any tricks on how to get them to come to trainings?
And I don't think we're really going to have time to get into a lot of that kind of sharing, or we're going to chew through our 2 hours really quickly. But we will capture that point, and then we can find some other ways to get that information to people. So that's a need. So if we could somehow come up with a way after this to share ways of getting leaders to come to meetings. I know that's absolutely key. You're not training leaders if you can't get them to come to things. Okay, I know we're going to feel like we're moving really quickly, but my sense was that we wanted to take advantage of the 2 hours that we all had together, and then I'm hoping that you're all going to extend your time together so you can continue these discussions later today, and also we'll continue into the future to these things like Lynette is raising. This is exactly what we want to know, is what are those needs and how can we help each other meet those needs. So the next criteria is that experiences are led by trained, caring adult staff and volunteers. And this goes right back to Lynette's point. We won't have trained, caring adult staff and volunteers if we can't get them to come to training. So that's one challenge that we've just identified. And we did have I don't know if any of you are using them, but we had provided a note-taking sheet that talked about, what strengths are coming up in our discussion and what challenges are coming up in our discussions, and then what are the needs. So we had given you kind of a note-taking sheet to try to capture that, if you find that useful and workable. So the whole idea of adult roles is just absolutely critical to STEM, because if you're going to do science and you're going to do inquiry, the role of the leader is absolutely critical to whether that's going to be successful, because for some people, this is a shift in the way we may be teaching and the way young people are learning. For some people, more than others. So the questions that are on the slide are, what does it mean to have programs delivered by staff and volunteers trained in positive youth development practices and best practices for delivering science content? That's a big challenge. Does the program have access to content experts? It may not be that the 4-H leader who's a content expert. It might be tapping in to somebody else in the community who's an engineer or a scientist. Not necessarily be the expert in youth development or leading the group, but to be that content expert. And what if the leader isn't an expert in the topics? How can we help leaders be comfortable, the volunteers be comfortable, because they're good at youth development. They may not be confident in the content. How can we maybe get them together so you have people that are comfortable with youth development, comfortable there with the content, working together to facilitate programming? And does the program utilize youth as partners adult leaders serve as coaches and co-learners? This is absolutely critical. I think this is one of the most important points, and one of the things that we need to continue to work with our volunteers as using the youth as resources. They have a lot to contribute. They have ideas, and when you're doing inquiry, the focus is on the learner and not on the teacher. So that's a really important point. And so we need to help our adult leaders feel comfortable in that role of co-learning, that they don't need to be the experts. Science is all about not knowing and asking questions so that the leaders can learn right along with the youth. There is a handout we suggested from Science 101, which is the 4-H competencies, the self-assessment. And we're going to give you just a couple minutes to take a look at that self-assessment and see if you can come up with any ways that you think that might be useful for professionals, and also is there any way you can see that that might be useful with volunteers. So we're gonna put our mic on mute and give you about another 3 minutes to talk about that. Okay, I know that wasn't a lot of time, and I just realized that I seem to have linked, actually not the handout I meant to link, but that's okay. So in 4-H Science, there's this whole thing about 4-H Science core competencies, and what I meant to link was the self-assessment, which is based on these same questions that are listed in core competencies, but it actually lets you or a volunteer go through and check off where you think maybe you're strong and where you might want to do some more work. So is there anybody that wants to share any thoughts with us?
Okay. Hi, this is Carrie from Orleans County, and I just had a comment on the last point. Does the program utilize youth as partners? Do adult leaders serve as coaches and coworkers? In my experience with inquiry with youth today is also that the youth need to buy into it too. They sometimes have hesitancies because a lot of information is being given to them rather than them trying to figure it out on their own. And so that could be probably a smaller hurdle, but still a hurdle to overcome.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because kids have been trained in school that somebody's always going to give them the answers. So the kids do need to have sort of a scaffolding of learning how to do inquiry and feeling comfortable with it. So you start with that structured and guided inquiry before, you don't immediately throw them into an open inquiry. So that's a really good point. Anybody else? Okay, well, Susan tells me we need to keep moving along to try to stay on our time frame. The next slide is just a follow-up to what we just talked about facilitation. It says a facilitator is like a good coach. That coach lets players play the game. They stay on the sideline, they guide, they instruct, they co-learn, but they don't take over. So for some adults, that's easier than other adults, but it's something you could certainly learn to do. The center of learning activity needs to focus on the learners. So some of us, if we think about some traditional classrooms where the focus is really on the teacher, we need to really shift that focus onto the learners taking responsibility for their own learning with that coach to help them, guide them, not just to completely leave them on their own. That facilitator needs to be flexible, provide enough time. That's one of the real big challenges with inquiry. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of resources, so those are definite challenges. That facilitator gives learners latitude to explore, which again takes time, and being able to get that point of being okay with not having answers, which for some of our leaders is difficult and something they're not familiar with or comfortable with. So that to get to that point where you can learn together and be comfortable in the role of learner. And there's the picture, if you can't see it, is a picture of Roger standing on the side of the robotics table with the kids frantically figuring out solving their problem. So the third criteria is activities that are led with an experiential and inquiry approach. And like I said before, the experiential and inquiry I combined. On the national checklist, they are separated, but I don't think you really can separate them because we need both in STEM learning. So I think, and this was not an original thought that I came up with. The original Are You Science Ready webinar suggested this same thing, so I picked up on it because it made a lot of sense to me. So on the slide it says, does the program intentionally utilize these approaches, meaning experiential and inquiry? To learn how to do science, experiential is essential but not enough. We've always emphasized that we do experiential education in 4-H. Sometimes we're better than other times, but that's always our goal, is that it be experiential learning. But when we get to STEM, it's not enough to just be experiential. We need to embed that inquiry in there so that we have experiential plus inquiry, which then allows for meaning making, that we understand important ideas, that the youth come to understand important ideas, that they can make meaning out of what they're learning, that the youth acquire important knowledge and skills. Both of those things, they're learning content and they're learning skills. Both of those things can be achieved through inquiry learning. And that we are transferring, that they have the ability to transfer learning to new situations, which is that experiential learning. So that's really key to anything we do in 4-H. So for some people, the idea of inquiry is new. For some of you, it isn't. And for many of our volunteers, if they haven't been trained as teachers, this may be a new idea. And it may be something that they do and that they do frequently, and they're just not used to framing it in this way or using that kind of vocabulary. So I think, one of our challenges is to help volunteers and leaders be comfortable with this idea of doing science, which is what inquiry means, that we are doing science. We're not opening a book and learning facts. We are doing science. We are answering questions. And that those questions are generated by the youth. That's what inquiry means. So science, to me, is something you do. It's a process. It's not, kids sometimes in schools are used to the idea of opening up a book and there's all these facts and that's what science is. Science is something you do. It's a process, and it's about asking questions and finding answers. And that the inquiry process is driven by the learner's curiosity. That's really key to inquiry, that it's not a question that the adult poses, that it's a question, and you can do things to engage kids and to spark interest in the topic that you're trying to drive them towards, but you want their curiosity to drive questions, and that the process is sustained by the learner's sense of ownership in the process. And so that it's not something that's externally imposed, but it's internally driven because of the learner's curiosity and interest. But it's not just a complete, you don't just turn it completely over to youth. There has to be guidance, there has to be structure, so that you do achieve those skills and knowledge, the content that you're trying to get to. So there is a lot that the leader needs to do, the facilitator. There's a lot of facilitating involved, and it's certainly something that needs to be practiced. And so now somebody else gets to talk. Hooray. Eileen is going to lead us in an activity that we all did in Pennsylvania. We really had fun doing it. I hope you can see the slide because there's a picture of Eileen and Margot. Margot has just dropped her helicopter in the picture. It's hard to see because it's almost below the tabletop. But we had a good time in Pennsylvania. We thought that this was a really useful activity. So this is the one we wanted to have you spend more time on. To learn about inquiry. So I am going to mute my mic and hope that Eileen can take this over.
Nancy, how much time do we have? Did she hear me?
Susan says about 20 minutes.
For the whole thing?
Well, I think to do the actual activity, and then we can extend some talking after it.
Okay. So, do you need to see me, or can I just give out instructions and then let each site do their thing and we'll come back together?
Should I?
I think it would be great if we could see you.
Okay, what I've done is turned off the end, and so we are seeing all of you. I'm not sure what you're seeing.
Yeah, I'm out of the picture, so. We don't have that technology to get me in the frame.
Okay, we see you now.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so for we're going to need the activity that says helicopter activity A shifted. And so for you guys here, I'll give you the shifted. That's the one. And you're going to need your cutout of that looks like. I don't know if anybody can see that. but it's got the outline for the square. Now, a lot of us have done something. This is an activity that's in Fabric and Flight, so a lot of us have done this before. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to incorporate this today was because when we did this at the Science Academy, I kind of looked at it and went, yeah. And then when I saw the difference in the two different approaches to doing this activity, I went, oh, I get it. And so that's sort of what I'm hoping is that we have the opportunity here today to tell it, so you have that same chance to say, oh, I get the difference. And I think what we're talking about, again, one of the things we wanted to get out of today was some common language. And so when we're talking about shifted and unshifted, I think the frame of reference here is really about the shifted activity is shifting the focus of the activity onto the youth rather than onto the instructor or the facilitator. And so I think when we do the two different activities, that will illustrate the difference to you. So, okay. So I'm just going to go through the instructions and then we'll let each site kind of do their thing and we'll come back together. So what I'd like each site to do is you're going to start with this, the shifted activity. You're going to start with the question of what forces act on a paper helicopter as it falls through the air. That's what we're exploring today. I would like each site to also talk about and share what they know about the phenomenon of flight before you start to do any of your experiments. Then you're going to do part one, which involves the hardest part is actually cutting out and folding your helicopters. So we'll do part one, and then at least one of the options, either A, B, or C, from part two, and then we'll come back together and we'll talk about doing the unshifted version of that. How does that sound? Okay. So, how many of you, when you talked about what you knew about the phenomenon of flight, how many came up with something that sounded like maybe you knew something about gravity, wave? No. How about thrust or lift? Anybody come up with that? Okay. Well, so who wants to share side of what their what was the criteria on their data sheet? Would somebody from one of the other sites want to share that?
Okay, so this is Southeast.
Westchester, thank you so much.
Okay, so we tested it, according to the design on the paper, and we were talking about gravity and lift. We added a paper clip to the bottom, which so that the helicopter fell a little straighter. Then we made a helicopter out of.
Okay.
We can hear everybody. Westchester's thing just went black. This is Matt from up North Country.
We lost Westchester. They were doing so well.
So Matt, what have you been doing?
We followed the instructions. We tried to stopwatch it as best we could. Did many of the same things that they did at Southeast. Added the paper clip to see if it would plane straighter. Kind of know there are 8-foot ceilings in here, so we could kind of get an idea about that. We also tried to fold the rotor blades to the ends of them just to see what that would do with the whole decreased surface area thing. So, and we timed the number of seconds that it fell. And for our beginning stuff, we talked about you need enough lift to overcome the force of gravity.
So the lift and gravity were concepts that did come up in your general conversation. Just in
Correct.
Discussion. Okay.
Yes.
So when you did your data sheets, anybody can chime in. What kinds of data were you collecting on your data sheets? What kind of information what did your data sheet look like? Anybody?
Hey, this is North Central. We collected information like the time it took to get to the ground, the height we were at, whether we were inside or outside, and the factors that affected it then, and which direction the propellers went.
Oh, which way the propellers?
Anybody else want to share what their data sheets looked like? Anybody from here?
Well, I wrote questions and then tested them and answered the questions.
So that's what your data sheet looked like. So the idea with this...
I did draw pictures. What I wanted to.
So the idea with this shifted activity is that we started kind of with an open-ended question, which was, what forces act on a paper helicopter as it falls through the air? That was kind of our general question. Now we're adults, and so we've got that terminology, so we came up with things like lift and thrust and gravity. And depending on the age of your youth, they may not have that terminology, but trying to get them in the discussion so that you can introduce those terminology and introduce that grammar and that language to them is one of the parts of that you can do as you're experimenting through this activity. So I'll move on then to the second page of this activity, which is the unshifted. And Nancy, how much time do we have? How much time do I have?
Another 5 minutes. Is that enough?
Sure. Okay. So then what I'll do is we'll let each site, because this you can run through the unshifted activity just with a different helicopter. Take a look at it and run through it the way it is written on that sheet. So it's helicopter activity B unshifted. And we'll come back in 4 minutes. And so what I'd like for everybody to do, in addition to experimenting with your helicopters, though, is just take a minute and make sure you read through the sheet, the unshifted sheet, and look at all of the questions that are there, because that's kind of an important part of the discussion that we're going to have in a moment. So, okay, so if we could get everybody to just come back together for a second, and I'll kind of do a little wrap up, and then we'll see what everybody thinks. My thought when I did this activity in Pennsylvania, I think some of us here had the same kind of response when it came to trying to it was come up with a data sheet to record what you observed. It was like, wait a minute, I need the answers. I need the questions before I can come up with the answers. And I think one of the things that we try to do with inquiry is we're trying to get away from that idea that we're giving them very specific structure under which we want the answers back. We're letting them evolve their knowledge, their experiences. And so one of the things that I like, Jennifer Fee from the Lab of Ornithology, she has what she calls the I Wonder board. And so I think, doing it in the shifted manner, the first exercise we did, you could easily see where you could put an I Wonder board up and have kids come up, well, I wonder what would happen if I used a bigger piece of paper. I wonder what would happen if so you could open it up and for kids to experience things in a much different way. And I think when we look at the unshifted, which is number B, the thing that hit me the most when I did this was, this is how I would probably do this activity. If you just gave me this and said, yeah, okay, this is how I would present it to a kid. I would want to be very specific and say, well, what direction did the blade spin? And give them a very specific data sheet. So I want you to record what direction the blade spun, how fast it fell. I want you to tell me what changes you made to the propellers. I mean, that would be kind of the way I would normally deliver it, but you still give them all the tools and let them experience it. So for me, it's still experiential, but it's not inquiry because we're not letting them come up with the questions and make those connections. We're making those connections for them. And I think what we're not saying is that you choose one over the other. I think what we're saying is that there's an opportunity to do both. But for those of us who are maybe a little more comfortable trying to let go, maybe, then doing it in the inquiry-based really allows a child to make those connections with their knowledge, and it allows them to really get the skills and the knowledge for themselves rather than for us feeding it to them. And I think what we discovered when we did the conversation about what do we know about the phenomenon of flight, well, we all sort of came up with those same general concepts of terms which is, gravity and lift, and I don't know if we came up with thrust, but we might have at some point if we had more time. And so we would have all come to that same place of knowledge, just kind of in our own journey. And so that's what I have to say. And so Nancy, I'll turn it back over to you. You can wrap this up.
Okay, thanks a lot, Eileen. I'm going to put the PowerPoint back up for those of you who can see it. So one of the things we did give you as a optional handout, I think, was the teacher identified shifts. This whole idea comes from the Exploratorium Institute for Inquiry, which each region in the country sent somebody from 4-H to this week-long institute that they do at the Exploratorium. So they got really in-depth, and that was the person who presented this in Pennsylvania was the person from the Northeast who went. But so when they asked teachers to identify the shifts, they said the language of instruction is more open-ended, that learners design their own data sheets, that learners choose what they investigate, that learners are asked to report what they think is significant. There's no assumption that there's a right answer, and there's an expectation that learners will have new questions when they're finished. So those are some of the things that represent shifts, and that you can find that handout somewhere on that page. So the next slide I have up here is a picture of the experiential learning model. And what I wanted to have you, that was one of the handouts you might have at your site there. What I wanted to have you do is just really quickly, because we're running behind a little bit on time, is I'm just going to mute my mic for just 1 minute or 2 minutes or something, and have you just really quickly talk to maybe the person sitting next to you about where do you think inquiry would fit. And there is no right or wrong answer, which is true to inquiry. So I'm just going to have you just take just a minute to do that. Okay, I know that doesn't give you very much time to talk, but we're trying to introduce some things, and that hopefully if something really strikes everyone as something interesting, you may be able to continue the discussion when we go offline. Does anybody want to share just quickly some point that they came up with?
We will.
Okay, so Capital was talking about the fact that, it's sort of a mindset that we are, you have to really approach it with the idea that you're going to take the time to be more open-ended. So it kind of flows through the whole experiential learning model. And again, it depends on your objectives. You may do something the quick and structured way to get to the next thing, or you want to spend that time doing the inquiry because that's your methodology. But again, it's being mindful of, are we doing it quick because we're just pressed for time, or are we doing it quick because that's a part of our bigger goals and objectives?
Or if that's just the way we've always
are we stuck it, yeah.
Versus trying to make changes to our own way of delivering projects.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and I think that, like I said, there is no right or wrong answer no right or wrong answer. So, but I think it will look different depending on what you're doing. But just giving some thought to places that you could embed that into the experiential learning model. The next.
Are we too late to comment?
Go ahead.
Oh, I just had, we had an observation here that when you go beyond experiential into inquiry-based, you get an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is everybody starts to click and come up with ideas, and it's like 1 plus, what is the word when you get 1 plus 1 is more than 2. Everybody just gets that motivation. But on the other hand, it's easier for somebody who's quiet and doesn't get into it to just sit back in the corner and not get involved, too. I've seen that here. I've seen it in other places. So I wonder, when we talk about outcomes, what we're looking for to get out of the activity, I think that we get a lot of outcomes that we don't expect, which is good, really. I mean, unidentifiable in the beginning, but things that we didn't even expect can be identified. I like your comment. But the question is, with this type of inquiry base, is it possible to have specific outcomes that we're looking for and get those? That's my question.
Yes, and that's up to the facilitator. So that, that's going to vary depending on how good of a facilitator you are. That you can guide the process if there are particular content and process skills you want the kids to get out of it. But there's sort of an art to that, and there's sort of a skill to it. So it's definitely going to take some practice for people to get there, and it's going to look different in every case. And I think the point about some of the kids maybe being left out, that's the youth development piece, is the facilitator and the other kids need to make sure that that doesn't happen, and that there's a lot of teamwork in science. Scientists do not work in isolation. They work with people. So that's really important for kids to learn that aspect of science. So, but good point, Chip. The next slide, if you can't see it, says promising practices for inquiry. There's a little graphic that I borrowed somewhere from the web that says it's not inquiry if students know what results they're supposed to get, the question and steps are predetermined for them, and the teacher is working harder than the students. So that was just, I thought, kind of a neat little graphic that I found that's a good reminder. And then I also put some of the things that I think Eileen or somebody mentioned that Jennifer Fee had shared with us, the idea of using an I wonder wall. So you capture those questions when they come up, and you may not be able to get to them right that moment, but you save them. I wonder this, I wonder that. Science is all about. A STEM word wall where you can capture some of the vocabulary. What you want to do is have the kids come up with these concepts in their own words and then help them name them, rather than just giving them the name to start with. Jennifer suggests using language like, and explaining to kids, well, that's what scientists do. You're doing what scientists do. That's the kind of question a scientist would ask. To point that out to kids. To call kids by whatever they're doing. They're an entomologist, or an ornithologist, or a geologist, they're a soil scientist, depending on what they're doing, to let them know that that's what they're doing and that there's a name for that they are being a scientist. She suggested finding ways to publish student work that they have at the Lab of Ornithology. They have found that to be really important, that they actually put out a newsletter with kids' research. That is an important part of science, that you publish your findings and that you share it with other people. And she said just getting kids outside generates questions. So that idea of getting them out to do things, and that in itself just generates questions. The next slide, well, I'll just go through these really quickly because we're tight on time, and you'll be able to go back and read these slides, or you can go back and watch the whole thing again if you want to, but you'll be able to go back and read the slides. So the next one says why inquiry, and the answer to why inquiry is the best way to learn science is to do science. And inquiry is learner-centered. It uses natural curiosity to motivate learning, and therefore it enhances learning. It allows learners to decide how to find the answer to a question instead of being told how to find the answer. This answers Chip's question. It can effectively teach content. It helps develop scientific process skills and abilities and independent thinking skills, which is important in all areas of learning for kids, not just science. It complements the experiential learning approach and activities that we already use in 4-H. And this again goes, what Chip said, is learning is a social process, and inquiry is also a social process, and that scientists do learn in social settings. So that's really important. And there were some handouts that were suggested to go along with this. One is called What is Inquiry? And then there was a handout called Inquiry Structure. I think this is maybe under the supplemental resources. Inquiry Structure for Learning Science Content. And it just gives a little model. Those are things you could go back and we know we put up a lot of resources, and we don't mean for you to go through and necessarily read all those, but I'm hoping that if there's something you're looking for in a particular area, then this will help you access resources that might be helpful. And then the next slide says, what does inquiry look like? So it follows science process rules. There's just the rules of how science works, that you come up with a claim that can be supported by evidence and that has been shared with peers. So this is what we want kids to learn about. How does science work? What is the nature of science? It's learner-centered, so that the youth are in charge of learning. The adult serves as a coach or facilitator. The learning is intentional. So some people think, oh, inquiry, it's just kind of free-for-all and the kids are just doing whatever. No, it needs to be intentional. It needs to be guided. There needs to be support there. That's that facilitated learning. It's not independent, informal learning on kids' own. It is facilitated. That there is active open questioning, There are opportunities for active investigations that include the acquisition of knowledge and skills. It's really important to keep that in mind. The kids are learning content knowledge, they're also gaining skills. It's flexible. You can use different types of inquiry. This is where sometimes people get confused or kind of hung up on inquiry, is they think it has to be open inquiry, where it's just completely open, the kids come up with a question, they find the answer. It doesn't need to be that way, and someone had raised the point that some kids are not at that point yet. They're not ready for that. It can be very structured, it can be very guided, so the inquiry can look different ways. Depending on your audience, depending on your comfort level as a facilitator, it can be done in very different ways, very flexible. And this type of learning aligns with what we know about how people learn, how kids learn, how anybody learns. So this aligns with the research base of how learning occurs, that we engage prior knowledge, that there's a metacognitive, that you're thinking about the way you're learning and you're aware of the way you're learning. So all those things that we know about learning, this aligns with. And then there's one more slide that says, how do I use inquiry? I like this particular point. The adult's job, whoever the facilitator, their job is to understand what the youth already know, to understand what they want to know, what the youth want to know, and to support them getting there. And I think that's a really good way to think of the adult role. And that it's also the adult's or the leader's responsibility to keep the kids safe and to make sure they've got the supplies they need. So that might be a very different kind of role than leaders normally think of taking. The leader provides a context that sparks interest. This is really important in inquiry, that you spark that interest of the kids, that it gets them wondering, that it starts that whole process of wondering and asking questions. That you ask open-ended questions, that you repeat concepts in the kids' words. First, the kids describe something to you, you repeat it, and then you can put a name to that if they're talking about lift or they're talking about drag, and let them know that there is a name for it, that is a scientific concept that they're describing. You give them time to explore and wonder. You let them arrive at their own testable question, and that's a really good learning, is learning what is a testable question, because there are questions that are testable and there are questions that aren't testable. That you ask, gee, what will happen? What do you think will happen if this, if that? That gets them thinking about testing. And that you encourage the generation of new questions, that you're always generating new questions, additional questions, that there isn't really an end to it.
Excuse me, Nancy, we had one question from the chat. There was an inquiry about wanting an example of guided inquiry.
So when we did the helicopter activity, you could write that in many different ways to decide how much guidance you want to give and how open you want to leave it. In the new 4-H curriculum development system, the new national system, there are templates. I think there's a template for structured, there might be a template for guided, but that would be a good place to look to get an example of what a lesson would look like that is guided, that is structured. This is one of those things we could go into more detail. We could do a webinar just on inquiry and different kinds of inquiry that we don't have time to go into today, but that's a question we should definitely hang on to and come back to at some point. So Roger, you were going to just real quickly say a little bit about questions. Are you out there, Roger?
Yes, can you hear me, Nancy?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'll go over this slide real quick about the questions that promote learning. The critical elements to inquiry is that the child seeks answers to the question and is not given the answers. To go over these questions, I have some examples here. Open questions do not have a single or right answer, and like based on my kids, what will you have for lunch today? And let them go from there. A closed question, fact-based or memory recall, some may be answered with yes or no, and that would be like, did you eat lunch today? And they'll just give you a yes or no answer to that. A broader question is a variety of acceptable and sometimes unpredictable responses, like what did you have for lunch today, or what was on the menu for lunch today at school? And then they can give you the range, and maybe there was squid or octopus on there, maybe not. Focus questions, particular predictable responses. Did you have peanut butter and jelly for lunch today? And with my kids, it would probably be yes every day. So with this, the group from Pennsylvania, we were introduced to the quick flip charts. I don't know if everybody got those. I know we have those here for our group. Each district has 2 that were bought to hand out. They have some really cool questions in there, really make you start thinking about the knowledge, the comprehension, the application, the analysis, and the synthesis, and the evaluation piece, and with some cool questions that are already on there. We thought these were very handy. We thought they had really good questions to start bringing ideas to the front, and we wanted to pass those out to everybody. So hopefully each district has those to pass out. Nancy, do you want me to let them do an open or close, or do you think everybody has that?
Well, they can take a minute or 2 to try that.
Okay, everybody, we'll take a minute. Just try to do an open and a closed question off of the same topic and see if everybody has that. We'll come back here in about a minute. I'll bring everybody back. We were just sharing some open and closed questions here, and being 4-H folks, we're always, I think, using the open questions to try to pull answers out of the kids. But would anybody want to share a set of questions that they had in their district?
I feel like, this is Melanie from Ulster. I feel like a good open-ended question that would really get you thinking would be something like, how do you think your lunch made it into your lunchbox? Like, what are the different elements of your lunch that had to happen for you to eat your lunch? So if it's a hamburger, a cow needed to be slaughtered, really, maybe a question for older youth, but it's really getting them to think more about connecting with their food also, as well as not just what it is that they're eating for lunch. Like, I feel like that's an open question that would go a little bit deeper of, like, what are the different elements that go into your lunch today?
I like that farm-to-table connection there for the lunch. A lot of kids do not think about that, and that's a very good one, Mel. Okay, Nancy, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Roger. Okay, we're going to have to move fairly quickly through these last few criteria, but the ones we've been through, I think, have been the most important, and we did want to spend a considerable amount of time on the experiential and inquiry. We felt that was the most important one to focus on, but I also wanted to present the whole framework so that you see it in its entirety, and then we can decide where we want to come back and spend more time at another time. So the next one is programs target the outcomes of the 4-H science logic model and consider the appropriate frequency and duration. So I already said a little bit about this earlier. So the handouts that went along with that was the national 4-H logic model for STEM, science, whatever it says, and then the New York State STEM logic model. So we provided both of those to you. So when you're planning programs or you're evaluating the programs that leaders are doing, you want to look at those outcomes. Is what we're doing going to get us to those outcomes, and which outcomes are we concerned with? So that focus is always on the outcome, and are we doing something that's going to get us that outcome? So it's really important. And that's more the professionals thinking about that than it's not that your volunteers, maybe you're going to actually have them using a logic model, but you want them to be very intentional about where are they trying to get to, and are they going to get there doing what they're doing. So the 2 questions on this slide are, do the program outcomes align with one or more outcomes for the national or New York State 4-H STEM logic model? Are the program hours and frequency appropriate for accomplishing intended outcomes? So that's really important, is that what we're doing and how long we're doing and how much we're covering, how much time we're spending is appropriate for the outcome that we want. And so that's going to vary a lot depending on what the outcome is, but you're very intentional about thinking about that. And so here's just a really quick activity. We're going to have to do it really quickly, but the activity is you think of a particular child you work with. Think of one particular child you know in 4-H. And number 1, what does this child now know? What skills have they developed? Or what attitudes have evolved? That's the first question about that child. Number 2 is, what would you hope that they do or achieve as a result of what they know? What kind of changes are they going to make? And then number 3 is, how could this impact the conditions of their life and potentially of others? So just each one of you individually, just take a really quick minute, try to picture a particular child and think of those questions at that level. What can they now, what do they know, what can they do, what do you hope they'll achieve, and what kind of greater impact do you think that'll have? Okay, I know that wasn't very long, but the point of that activity in the next slide is to tie what that thought, thinking about a particular child, to the different kinds of outcomes, short-term, mid-term, long-term outcomes on a logic model. And this might help you think about those things in the concrete rather than in the abstract. So if you think about a particular child and what do they now know, what kind of skills do they have, what kind of aspirations do they have that they might not have had before, then that's your short-term outcome. It's the knowledge change, the skill change, the attitude change, the aspiration change. That's short-term outcomes. Then when you move to mid-term outcomes, that's the actual behavior change. What has the child done? Maybe they signed up for a physics class and they weren't going to do that before. Maybe they've gone out and done some job shadowing. They've gone out and done a community project. Those behavior changes, that's your midterm outcomes. And then the long-term outcomes are those broader kinds of conditional changes in society, that people are more scientifically literate, that we have more people going into STEM careers. Those are those big long-term outcomes that are often you might not be, are not the things we're usually evaluating. We're evaluating the short-term and the mid-term outcomes. So that's an activity you might want to do with volunteers too, to think about that, about outcomes. The next criteria is opportunities to improve science abilities. And in the rest of the world, we usually refer to these as science process skills. And in 4-H, we're calling them abilities. But I think you can think of those fairly interchangeably. So what the Institute for Inquiry at the Exploratorium helped us do was take these 7 overriding science process skills that are on this screen, if you can see it, observing, questioning, hypothesizing, predicting, planning and investigating, interpreting, and communicating. And then there are 30 4-H science abilities, which is kind of an overwhelming list. So in the handout from The Power of Win, there is a process skills handout that actually takes the 4-H 30 abilities and sort of categorizes them within these 7 science process skills. So, I mean, if you're talking to a volunteer, it might be a lot easier to talk in terms of these 7 overriding ones that kids are observing, that they're questioning. And there was a really good activity we did at the Pennsylvania Academy that if somebody's interested in doing an activity about science abilities, we could share with you, or we could do it in a Polycom or something. So I think you just need to think about what's the best way to introduce that to volunteers that isn't overwhelming. Just that kids are doing skills, they're learning science skills, and that it should be intentionally built in. So the next slide says 4-H STEM abilities and science process skills, and there's some questions here. Do the program activities intentionally target one or more of the STEM abilities? Does the delivery of the program include strategies planned to develop or strengthen one or more of the abilities? And then this was a question I added. Is it easier to embed the 30 4-H STEM abilities into the 7 overriding process skills, just to make it easier to think about? But that's when you're doing science, you're using skills, you're developing skills that you're going to use again. So the skills are really important. At the same time that kids are learning content, they're developing skills that can be applied in any kind of science setting or an engineering setting or whatever it might be. I think because we're so tight on time, we won't stop and do an activity, but we did provide some materials if you want to go back and look at those. The last one is the programs are based on National Science Education Standards. And this is the one I think that you probably need to think about the least, that I wouldn't get hung up on, that I certainly wouldn't have volunteers. I probably wouldn't even introduce this to volunteers. But there are these, if you can see these slides, there's National Science Education Standards are the ones that have been around for a while, that we've all been talking about. Science is inquiry, physical, life, earth, and space sciences, science and technology, science and personal and social perspectives, and the history and nature of science. That those things, no matter what you're doing, it's going to work in there somewhere. I wouldn't get too worried about it. So here's another slide about the National Science Education Standards, which go back to 1996. It's the overriding vision of a scientifically literate populace, and with these principles. Science is for all youth. Learning science is an active process, which is that inquiry. Science reflects the intellectual and cultural traditions that characterize the practice of contemporary science. That's this whole idea of nature of science. How does science work? And the standards outline content. Youth need to learn about science. But again, whatever you're doing in the area of science and engineering, you will probably find somewhere in the standards. It's not something to get worried about. And then I just want to introduce the idea that there are now coming on board, there are going to be new Common Core standards. So you may hear about that. The science standards are not quite there yet. They're still working on them. There is a website I've provided here, www.nextgenscience, all one word, .org. Depth over breadth, greater coherence across grade levels, helping students understand cross-cutting nature of science concepts, and ensure that students apply their learning through scientific inquiry and the engineering design process to deepen their understanding. So this is the next generation of standards. It's not going to change things for us very much. We're still going to be doing the same skills, the same content. I wouldn't worry about it too much. It's coming down the pike, though, just to be aware of that. The next, really quickly, assess your program for 4-H science readiness. You've been asked as part of 4-H Access to say whether a program is science ready. So you want to analyze your programs on both content and context. So we keep thinking about the science content and process and the youth development context. So you're going to want to be thinking about both of those areas as you're assessing programs. So you can compare items to we've introduced these 6 checklist items, and then you can compare them to the curriculum you're using, to the activities you're doing at different levels, and to the participation structure. So what does the youth development context look like? And the next slide is a sort of a rubric that lays out the checklist criteria on the left, and then those 3 items, curriculum, activities, and participation structure on the top. And you're not going to hit curriculum, activities, and participation. You don't necessarily need to hit every criteria in each of those columns. So but it's a way to kind of think about what you're doing. It gives you an easy way to kind of take this chart and it gives you a way to think about what you're doing and to assess it. You can come back and look at this slide if you want to. It's just some upcoming things. There is more coming in line for the national level, more science webinars. All the science webinars that have been done have been archived. There is a new Why Science and Science Self-Assessment coming online. There is going to be more help for the national level on evaluation basics. That's something we're going to be working on, is evaluation in New York and common measures. So it looks like there's going to be more help coming from the national level for that. There's going to be more modules coming online about inquiry-based learning this fall. So there's going to be more and more things that we can use to help us if we're trying to train leaders and just do professional development among ourselves. And then to just wrap up, we hope you will continue this discussion with your colleagues today and into the future at the district level, at the state level. We really want to know what kind of needs you identify today for professional development opportunities. What do you want? This was just an introduction. We were just touching on these things. We'd like to go more in depth on these things where you see the need. So let us know. Gee, we really want to do something just on inquiry or just on adult roles or whatever it is. We hope you'll discuss that and share some of that with us after today. If you've taken notes, which I know we've packed a lot in, so maybe nobody's had time to take notes, but if somebody has taken notes, or if you can jot some down when we're done, please share them so we can see what kind of things were coming up at each site so that we can help facilitate that from the state level and the PWT level. We hope that you all have printed the evaluation forms. Nigel was gracious enough. He has a program evaluation background, so Nigel helped me with that evaluation, and then we hope to follow up with that in a few months to see what you've actually done with this, but we really want the feedback from today. I'm going to stop, see if Susan or anybody else wants to say anything before we go offline.
One question. question, Nancy, about the STEM plan and the logic model report identifies many outcomes by number. What are you referencing?
I'm referencing the Cornell Cooperative Extension Plan of Work.
And
that's something I could post someplace or tell
Okay.
you how to get to it. That came off the net, if you go on the Netway, you'll see some more detail that doesn't show up when you print it. But that's good. All these things, we'll keep track of all these questions and we can follow up on them. I'm going to mute my mic to see if anybody else wants to say anything. I thank you very much for participating and for being willing to be guinea pigs with a new approach that we've tried today, and we really want to know how you think this worked. The 2 hours felt very, very packed. We probably tried to put a little bit too much in, but we really want to follow up on this more in the future in more detail.
I want to thank everyone for coming together at your sites and for participating. I'd also like to acknowledge that Linda Rayer has joined us here at the Broadcast Center. So welcome, Linda.
So thanks, and we hope you continue your discussion there over lunch or afternoon meetings or whatever it is you are doing. And please share any thoughts you have that you can share so we can get an idea of what went on in each site and what you think is important. And I know we did provide a lot of handouts, and you probably really haven't had time to look at them, but hopefully you'll take them back, and if you're looking for an answer, you can refer to them.